ora, tēnā koutou. I'm a Kiwi and a proud Northlander. I started my career in the building industry in the mid-90s. From sort of the late 90s through to the middle 2000s, I enjoyed a period over with a sustainable design company over in the UK. And that was a great time of sort of development and learning. The market was very advanced in those times over in the UK. And so it was great to sort of come back and try and apply some of that learning back into the New Zealand market from mid-2000s. Through then, obviously, there's been quite a bit of change that I've been able to observe, and in the development of sustainable buildings in the New Zealand context. And most recently, I'm responsible for the building services engineers and building scientists we have in New Zealand, Australia and Southeast Asia. And that gives me the pretty privileged position to actually identify trends around the globe and provide some of my personal insights today on basically trends across the market. So you'll hear a lot about change in my presentation, but it's also very good to see that some underlying philosophies don't change. This is a slide I sort of spoke to about 10 years ago, which underpins some of the positioning we have around sustainability. You know, it's not about adding things on, it's about understanding what buildings are there to do, looking to minimise and maximise the opportunities in the natural environment as a first port of call, optimise how we deal with that from a systems perspective, and then seek to optimise, and the important part there is the measurement and ongoing fine-tuning aspects. You'll see I've updated, the only update I have done to the slide, Andrew, is in Neighbours New Zealand. It's just part of actually maintaining that cycle. And it's a key thing. The one area that I haven't spoken about strongly there is probably value, and I think that is an area which has become under much more focus, and I'll talk about that more progressively as we go through this presentation. Hopefully, if it works. So a few sort of observations. In the pre and post GFC environment, coming back to New Zealand, you know, the mid-2000s, there's a real momentum in green building design. And we had a really buoyant market in the mid-2000s, and we sort of defied some of the commercial or the GFC impacts until a little bit later on, and we were in a very buoyant market sort of right through to 2008, 2009. And some of the response strategies you look back on now, you cringe a little bit with some of our application to those technologies, and we added quite a bit of things to buildings, and there was a bit of green bling, and there was also effectively a lot of people promoting green outcomes but not really measuring it. So I think that's where the Green Building Council timing was actually quite strong, because that gave you a third-party independent verification that we're actually achieving some of the outcomes. So there's a real rise in the rating tool side of there. Post the GFC, I think we looked back on some of that earlier responses in the sort of mid-2000s, and some of the value wasn't potentially achieved as strong as it could be. And with the focus through the GFC, there's a real strong link to value. And what is the evidence? How can we actually demonstrate these are actually making significant changes and improvements to our building stock? So it did tighten up a lot in that regard. This is a slide which has been touched upon already today. This was the outcome of a value case for sustainable buildings done in the 2000s. And this really looked to try and identify, you know, what are the costs associated with green buildings. And it talked about, Sam touched on it earlier today, it talked about, you know, if the capital cost of a build is 1, then it was about 3 times that amount in terms of the operational costs through the life cycle of that building over a 20-year term, and then a salary cost of about 20 times. I mean, this was on a discounted 8.5% cash rate, so for some of the economists in the room, that you know, I'll just make that clear. But I look at this now and I think salary costs is the wrong way to basically look at this. I mean, effectively buildings are about providing an environment for us to undertake activities. So it's what's the value you're producing from those buildings. And if you look at the value that's produced from the staff working on those things, it'll be 2 to 3 times that amount. So when we're talking about, again, it just reinforces and highlights the improvement we can have in that regard, really is what the purpose of buildings is. So some of the current trends, and that, you know, we've seen again some commentary today on that. I mean, there's a comment there from Rick Federici, who is the ex-CEO of the US Green Building Council, and that really talks about wellness and it talks about the internal environment, picking up on that theme of productivity, which ties back to, you know, what are the buildings here for? How can we basically optimise the value through that process? So some of the other trends where I'm seeing in more contemporary market at the moment is there is an increasing war for talent. So the demands of our occupants and a lot of the commercial developments are increasing, and the quality aspect talks to that as well. People are looking for flexibility and adaptability, not only in how they work, where they work, but how their building relates and reacts to that as well. And landlords and tenants are looking for increased returns from their assets. So it's changing some of the, and you see this manifesting itself into activity-based working. So that's really focusing on different types of activity through the built space, so people can focus their activities in the best location for it. So it's really about increasing the utilisation. The co-location sort of shared work environments. We're seeing more of those startups looking to try and get in those environments where they're leveraging ideas off people, but also basically sharing some of the facilities and buildings where you're increasing that utilisation. So there's an increasing move to sort of engaging in customer-focused developments. One of the examples of this, I guess, you can't help buildings engineers talking about buildings. This is one of the examples which is sort of manifesting some of that, those items I was just touching on. This is the Grid Auckland development down in the Wynyard Quarter. That was developed in a sustainable framework. So Panuku set out some pretty aspirational goals. But in essence there you've got co-location of lots of different organisations and effectively sharing some of the facilities. So the density of the operation is actually increased. You're not having a meeting room or a reception for multiple parties. You're combining some of those activities. And what you are seeing, and what the stresses that's putting on buildings, is you're getting varied times. So people are working with time zones around the place. So the building hours of occupation are increasing. You're getting more use out of the same environment. And it's forcing us to think about how we actually rate and assess buildings. You know, historically, maybe somewhat cynically, you look at some of the earlier buildings in the late 90s that being really efficient, big government buildings at one person per 20 square metres. Now we're operating at one person per 8. So we're halving the building stock. So that is real efficiency. So getting people into these spaces where we're optimising the utilisation in these spaces is reducing the overall environment. And if you're doing that and you're intensifying the space, the quality aspect comes to the fore. So you can see some of the types of spaces that are starting to pervade the office fit-outs across the place. The tailwinds have all disappeared. Well, it seems to have not translated too well, but I mean, I've presented a whole host of challenges here. There are some tailwinds that are actually supporting us. One of the things that has changed recently is the cost of basically the cost of collecting data, the cost of sensors. Those things have really plummeted. And what that's enabling us to do is some of the technologies that we were using previously were too complex to basically employ in buildings. With the cost of those things coming down, effectively we're starting to see and realise some of those opportunities in today's buildings. We're able to now, with all this information, you know, the big data that comes to us, it's been effectively almost too much. We're now getting mechanisms and abilities to actually utilise that data and make meaningful insights from it. And that is a change. It was a bit stifling sort of 5 or so years ago. Now we're starting to actually get that and be able to manipulate in a way that actually we can make business decisions on. And I'm just trying to remember what the third one was. The increase in some of the elements around, or the uptake on some of the renewable technologies. And what that has done, and it's really decreased the prices. So historically, when payback periods might have been 160 years on PVs, now they're talking about 15 to 25. You know, as the mass production of these is basically arriving, that's actually starting to become part of the building lexicons. We're struggling a little bit with this, aren't we? Another example I'll just touch on is I was over in Sydney, must have been about 3 months ago, and walking through one of the tenancy floors there in Barangaroo. And this is a major tenant, sort of 20,000 square metres of space. And some of the things that actually picked up, it was a Green Star rated building, huge comments on efficiency, a lot of focus on the customer, but equally they had they had an activity-based working environment, so lots of active working, but they actually monitored the people coming in and out just through heat-seeking cameras, so they could tell how many people were on each floor, so they could actually maximise where people were going and how people were using buildings. So that was actually, they're starting to provide some insights. one of the things that they were measuring and monitoring afterwards, which sort of undid them a little, so they remain a little bit nameless, was because they were having people spread so far across the buildings, they hadn't gone for internal stairs. And what they tended to find was, with teams being remote, suddenly the personal connection wasn't as strong as it could be. So they found the lift usage was really high. So they struggled with some of the lift performance in the building. So some of these things have sort of unintended impacts, but we're starting to see now and be able to measure the value of those things. So we're actually able to have justified cases as to why you have internal stairs, what the benefits are. So that's starting to get some real changes. And I think Connell was over at this, looking at this site on a property council tour. It must have been about 5 years ago, I think, when we were over in Sydney. And I was looking down on the site, and I remember casting my mind back there. You walk around the leasing agent signs. They were talking about Green Star design. I'm sitting there now talking about Green Star or neighbours outcomes. So they're basically, the Green Star is just part of the building process, but they're now focusing on neighbours. I expect to see them focusing on performance results in the near term. This is shifting gears a little bit. This is a development we're doing over in Singapore, and this is for the Singapore government. In essence, what they're doing is an inland port, but it's supporting a whole host of clean tech type technologies. And what they're trying to do is they're solving it in quite an innovative way. They're removing the transport requirements and basically say, let's go underground. And they're making some really bold moves. They're going automated vehicles, effectively to move all these sorts of activities underground, and they're going electric. So that means you don't need the ventilation. They're making some pretty big calls on just getting this really efficient sort of arrangements in there. And they're creating the infrastructure effectively there for developers to basically build on top of. So it's quite progressive. And in that same arrangement there, in the same development, because they're providing all of those opportunities from a base perspective, they're also encouraging shared operations around training facilities, shared operations around the kitchens, and shared operations in and around some of the reception and engagement areas. So doing this is effectively, to enable that, there's a technology overlay, which was hugely complex, but now with a bit of focus and a bit of request on it, these things are becoming accessible and basically usable. So people are now starting to actually realise some of the potential which has been promoted in the industry for a long time. And that comes down to effectively increasing uptake. That's an area of design which is moving quite quickly. This is a picture I took in our office in Singapore 3 weeks ago, and the little sensor on the side there, I said, what's that? And this is effectively a real good example of someone had just gone out and basically bought an indoor environmental quality sensor. So $50, plug it in, suddenly it gives you your PM ratings, your IEQ ratings, your VOC ratings. And it just hooks into your Wi-Fi, monitors outside, monitors inside. So these are technologies which have been available for 10 or 15 years, but now are becoming, consumerised. So people are expecting that outcome. They're expecting to see, and they want to know. So the black boxes, to a certain extent, is coming off. A little closer to home, this is some work we did with Victoria University in an existing building campus. So this is the Hub project down in Wellington. And this is a process where we're working quite closely with Victoria Uni, and they said, listen, from a design perspective, building worked very well, but we're seeing that energy use creep up over time. So we've gone in there and basically done some recalibration, fine-tuning, and the payback time for that effort's less, or about 1.2 years. So, and they're saving effectively 35% annualised of their energy consumptions. And that's just really getting things working right. But the interesting thing for me in that regard is the picture on the left-hand side there shows the progressive savings you're getting there. But we're now starting through artificial intelligence to, rather than just see this information and try and basically intervene, get automatic intervention happening. So you're setting some characteristics. It's testing what's happening in these buildings. It's automatically finding out problems. So you're not waiting a year later to compare your annual results, or even monthly. In a live fashion, you can actually intervene. And that's actually where the continuous improvement activity is really focusing. And the one on the left there talks about, over time, tracking how your performance is going with neighbours. So again, it's just basically providing some real-time impact so people can see the impact they're having. This is another part of the equation, but again, another example of some of this data becoming available. This is effectively a small job in the Wynyard Quarter here in Auckland, which we've created a digital twin. So in essence, this is the building, and we've actually got a live model which exactly replicates it. And you're enabling the interface from that building, from a live perspective, to see how the building is performing. And if you've got so you can actually see when the filter needs changing. It'll tell you. You can go there, you've got a QR code, you snap it, send a photo off, it raises a tag, maintenance happens at the right time when it's needed. So these are sorts of technologies which, again, it's all been possible, but it's taken with, as technology has been able to cope with the additional data, we're now starting to realise the benefits. But it's not universal by any means. Another sort of example in the big data space is some work we've been doing with the Ministry of Education. And this is a snapshot of some live data that we're looking at from school energy uses and water usage. And this is basically got 250 schools in the South Island. You can sort it by ward, but you can automatically look at per person activity usage or per square metre usage, and you can see where the outliers are. So you're now able to use this tool and this process to actually focus your investment decisions. Where do we focus our outcomes? If everyone was operating at the norm, how much savings would we have? So you're starting to be able to quantify that and help people make informed decisions and actually act. Because you can worry about a lot of these things, but if you're not actually doing something about it, that's when you start to care. So we've not got the tools now where we can really start to engage. And I'll touch on, this is one of the examples I like to report on. This is an example which I think illustrates the importance of what the market can do when given the right conditions. Singapore, they've had some sort of fairly lofty ambitions to become a green city and all these sorts of things, and they've been promoting Green Mark as their version of Green Star effectively to help measure and adapt that. One of the advantages they had there from a planning and regulatory perspective was you got some planning benefits if you got Green Mark. One of the activities they had, if you get green roofs, just as a very simple example, you could basically get some planning arrangements. So the early responses to that are shown there. So as you'd expect, people put a green roof on the top of the building, it's all well and good, we carry on. Where it's moved to is that. People are starting to recognise the value of what we're doing. The image on the left there is the Woha designers, it's a Marina One job we're doing in Singapore. They say we're not putting the green space out, let's actually capture it. Recognise the value that it offers to our people, to our environment, to the quality of our building. So they're starting to capture that in there. To the right there is a picture of, we had TOP, was at back end of October, so this is a picture from a drone actually saying how it's turned out. So you're starting to see those visions being realised. The middle picture there is a design we're currently doing for a hotel, the Park Royal Hotel, which again, from a green perspective, they're looking at, well, how do we actually get, what's the value in it? It's not seen as a cost of putting a green roof on, it's now what's the value? And it's pretty exciting, and the market has effectively, through that encouragement, shifted to, there's a requirement in Singapore now that if you've got a plot land of 1 hectare, you've got to have 1 hectare of green space on your developments. So, it's just moved there, and the market's adjusted, and you're getting those outcomes. So, it can be done. So, I'll leave you with a couple of final thoughts. As we touched on, there's quite a bit of change happening. I think we are at a bit of a paradigm shift with the cost of controls and the availability to interpret that changing. Some of the design activities that the technologies we have been available to us over time are now available, and they're actually able to be used. This will sound like a bit of a plug, but I'll say it anyway. One of the disappointments I guess I have is still some of our approach as an industry to how we procure these activities. If I use an analogy, often we find ourselves competing in the commoditisation of some of the design process, and you'll find yourself competing. And we want a burger. So they'll go to McDonald's, they'll go to Wendy's, they'll go to Burger King, and you've got this typical burger response. And you're sitting there thinking, oh, maybe do you want fries with that? And it's a very narrow response. I think we can do better. But I think Connell touched on it earlier today around the onus is on us to demonstrate what is possible and what the value you can add. So I think the onus is on that. So when the procurement opportunities come, people are talking about what is possible, what can happen. And then I think you'll actually have that opportunity to respond. So if I could leave you with one sort of comment today, it would be when you are trying to procure these things, ask for more and expect more. I think you'll see that Singapore example, we'll be able to deliver it. Thank you.